A fiery air collision south of Los Angeles kills at least 54 people. A Mexican airliner and a small private plane scatter flaming wreckage over a suburban neighborhood.
NBC Nightly News, reported by Chris Wallace.
Good evening. There are bodies scattered all over the place. That was the chilling report from Cerritos, California, after an Aeromexico DC-9 collided with a small plane. There were at least 51 people on the jetliner headed from Mexico City to Los Angeles. And late today, Aeromexico said there may have been even more passengers than that on the plane. There were 3 people on the other small plane. Police say all were killed and that there were more victims on the ground. NBC's George Lewis reports from the crash site.
It was just before noon when the Aeromexico DC-9 disappeared from the radar screens at Los Angeles International Airport and plummeted into a residential neighborhood about 30 miles away. It had collided with a small plane, a Piper Tomahawk. Flaming wreckage and bodies were strewn over an area of several blocks. One sheriff's deputy described the scene as pandemonium. Darrell Levy was outdoors and watched it happen.
I was washing my car and I looked up in the sky and it was a loud boom and your big airplane turned over, and then when she turned over she came down.
9 houses were destroyed, half a dozen others damaged. At least 5 firefighters were injured battling the blazes. A piece of the Mexican jetliner's tail section was visible sticking out of the roof of one of the houses. A team from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was dispatched to begin identifying the bodies. They could not immediately tell how many people had been killed on the ground. Jim Bobber said he narrowly missed getting hurt.
I heard a roaring of airplane engines and a loud boom, and all the stuff in the garage started shaking. When I came out, the house across the street was already on fire.
It is not the sort of thing people in this neighborhood will easily forget.
Saw the house across the street, it was on fire. I ran over there. Couldn't get in there, it was too hot. I was barefoot and I started burning my feet and I couldn't get in there.
Aeromexico Flight 498 started in Mexico City and made several stops in Mexico before continuing to Los Angeles. At the airport in Los Angeles, the relatives of those aboard were being kept behind closed doors, and an airline spokesman had little to say. There's no explanation so far for the mid-air collision. It was a clear day, pilots operating under so-called visual flight rules, not dependent on instruments. A team from the National Transportation Safety Board is en route to begin the investigation. George Lewis, NBC News, Los Angeles.
There was another near mishap in Greece today. A British Airways TriStar jet with 362 people on board made an emergency landing in Athens Airport. A 10-foot piece of the left wing snapped off, but the jet touched down safely and no one was hurt. American reporter Nicholas Danilov spent his second day in a Moscow jail as the Soviets publicly accused him of espionage. Danilov's wife met with him briefly, and as Phil Bremen reports, she fears he is going to be in that prison a long time.
Soviet television tonight announcing the arrest of Nick Danilov of U.S. News and World Report. The 52-year-old correspondent, the official announcement said, was caught red-handed during a spying operation. Materials confiscated from him, the announcement went on, proved that he had engaged in espionage. After a total of almost 10 years covering Moscow, this was to have been Danilov's last week. So yesterday, his wife said, Danilov had a farewell meeting outside this building near their apartment. The newsman walked along this street with a Soviet acquaintance who had promised Danilov some out-of-town newspapers. They walked here to the Lenin Hills, where the acquaintance handed Danilov a sealed packet, and then 8 policemen pounced on him. They took him to this jail. Only then was the packet opened, revealing maps marked top secret and Soviet military photographs. His wife labeled the arrest a classic setup, apparently in retaliation for the spying arrest of a Soviet United Nations employee in New York last weekend. Escorted by American diplomats, Mrs. Danilov and her 16-year-old son, Caleb, today made their first trip to the jail. They took toiletries, books, clothing, most of which they later had to take home again. Caleb is to leave in 3 days for school in the United States and was afraid he might not see his father for a long time. But Caleb had to wait alone, and journalists were pushed outside while Mrs. Daniloff and officials saw her husband. A Soviet guard made sure no one else watched. About an hour later, Mrs. Daniloff emerged, composed but angry.
They are treating him well insofar as he is not being beaten up, roughed up, or verbally abused. However, I consider the whole detention to be totally barbaric.
I just think of all, I think it's a stupid game that the Russians are playing to try and get, be equal with the states.
Under Soviet law, Mrs. Daniloff is entitled to see her husband only once a month. So far, no charges have been filed against him, but he can be held without charge indefinitely. Phil Bremen, NBC News, Moscow.
U.S. News and World Report announced today that its chairman, Mortimer Zuckerman, will leave tonight for Moscow to press for the release of Daniloff. Meanwhile, there has been a new charge that the Russians tried to frame Daniloff in a similar manner 2 years ago. Norma Quarles reports from New York.
When the Today program was broadcast from Moscow 2 years ago, Bryant Gumbel interviewed Daniloff and asked him about being watched by the KGB, the Soviet state police.
You shouldn't get the impression that we are intensively watched every day or every hour. But when we do something that brings our face, our writing to their attention, which bothers them, then the surveillance may become much more intensive.
Alexander Goldfarb, a Columbia University professor originally from the Soviet Union, says that in April of 1984, the KGB tried to get his father to frame Nicholas Daniloff.
He was invited to the Moscow KGB office, and they offered him to take part in a scheme to frame Nick Daniloff, essentially in a similar setup as it is now, to pass something on Nick, and they would take care of Daniloff, and my father would be permitted to leave smoothly.
Goldfarb says his father, a Soviet Jew who's been trying to leave the country for years, refused.
When my father refused to cooperate, they punished him, and punished him swiftly and severely. He may be paying with his life.
Goldfarb says his father, a diabetic, is in a Moscow hospital where he'll undergo a second leg amputation and may not live. Norma Quarles, NBC News, New York.
Coming up on Nightly News, British sculptor Henry Moore is dead. He was called the best in modern times. And they defy more than death. Today's stunt women take on preconceptions about what a woman can do. A strong earthquake rumbled across Eastern Europe last night, toppling chimneys and cracking walls. The quake, centered near Bucharest, Romania, measured 6.9 on the Richter scale. Moscow radio reported a number of injuries in the Soviet Republic of Moldavia, but did not mention any deaths. Well, this was Bishop Desmond Tutu's last Sunday, preaching in his church in a black township in South Africa, before assuming a higher role in the Anglican church there. It was supposed to be a happy event, but instead Tutu joined in mourning the victims of a new round of violence. NBC News correspondent Mike Betcher was there.
The farewell service to his old parish in Soweto was said to worshipers still grieving over last week's clash between police and black protesters that left 21 people dead. The church stands near the spot of the confrontation. A few whites who drove from white Johannesburg to the sprawling township carried daffodils to show their sympathy. Also in the congregation was Senator Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, a proponent of sanctions against South Africa.
What have we done that we should suffer for so long?
The service was to be a celebration for Tutu, the Bishop of Johannesburg, who next week assumes the leadership of the Anglican Church in Southern Africa. Instead, the parishioners heard a grieving Tutu.
That despite all that the powers of the world may do, we are going to be free. It will not be cheap. The price we have paid already is a heavy price. And we are going to be called on to pay yet more in lives.
The choir sang, "What have we done? Our sin is that we are black." There was, however, a moment of celebration. Tutu danced around the altar. He was celebrating some new arrivals to his old church. They were baptized on Tutu's final day here, the newest residents of a troubled township. Mike Betcher, NBC News, Johannesburg.
Tomorrow is Labor Day, a day off for most workers and a traditional day of celebration. But while the parades will go on this year, organized labor has much to worry about. Chief Economics Correspondent Irving R. Levine reports that union membership is dwindling, and new workers are looking the other way.
Court clerks in Chicago celebrating because a majority voted to join a union. But nationwide, unions are losing more elections than they're winning. At this Buffalo, New York hotel, a meeting to organize workers failed. Only 3 people showed up. Typical of the hard times unions have fallen on this Labor Day.
The jobs that we once considered the permanent bedrock of the economy are vanishing. Jobs in the metals industry and industrial machinery, shoes, leather goods, textiles, and apparel.
1.25 million factory jobs, labor's traditional stronghold, lost to foreign competition in the past 5 years. And when foreign manufacturers build plants in the U.S., they are cheered by state officials hungry for jobs.
Oh, what a feeling it is today.
But the foreign-owned plants are often non-union. A new threat, the growing use of non-union temporary workers in jobs that used to go to union workers. Jobs that include none of the benefits unions have won for their members.
Ameritemps, a very tempting alternative to humdrum jobs.
In Washington, union leaders say that key lawmakers are hostile to their efforts to win jobs and wage increases.
While they're trying to help their employees, they turn around and really cost them jobs because they always go to an extreme.
When somebody like Orrin Hatch makes a statement of that kind, he is saying that the American worker is greedy.
Unions, which won benefits through strikes in the past, trace their present troubles to the strike by air traffic controllers at the start of the Reagan presidency.
If they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
An ultimatum that toughened management's attitude everywhere and has led to strikers, TWA flight attendants, Hormel meatpackers, losing their jobs. Unions are fighting back, experimenting with ways to attract members, offering credit cards at far below the going interest rate, intensifying organizing drives, soliciting new members with leaflets, and with free meals where pep talks are part of the menu.
You want those raises because the only way you're going to get them is to have AFSCME representation.
But many workers are not listening. Union membership is down. In 1980, 23% of workers belonged to unions, only 19% now. Soon after Labor Day, unions will face a new problem in the tax overhaul Congress is expected to pass. The bill ends tax deductions for union dues. That will add to the cost of belonging to a union and could result in a further weakening of unions. Irving R. Levine, NBC News at the U.S. Capitol.
It is an awesome natural event that has never happened before in our lifetime. And it's too early to tell what the relentless shifting of a mighty glacier will mean to the environment and to the people. NBC News correspondent Reed Galen reports from Alaska.
I'm going to open up with a set of angles, and then I'll be ready to shoot, okay?
Yeah, Excited scientists are charting an event that, in geological terms, has occurred in an instant. The Hubbard Glacier, a 90-mile stretch of crackling, age-old ice, recently surged forward more than 100 feet a day, closing the mouth of a large fjord and turning it into a lake.
Oh, this is fun. There's no doubt about that.
Perhaps 100 seals and porpoises are now trapped in the 30-mile-long lake. Freshwater runoff is killing their food supply. Experts disagree on whether a rescue would be possible. It is difficult to apply ordinary human perspective to the Hubbard Glacier. Chunks of ice snapping off its advancing edge are the size of 30-story office buildings.
If we understand this process, we may better understand the process by which, say, Antarctica, should it suddenly surge forward, could affect the world's sea levels.
What is happening here is a spectacular natural phenomenon. For scientists, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to watch nature literally in action. But in a nearby community, the glacier's movement is seen as something quite different, as a potential disaster.
Save the whales, save the glacier, save the porpoises, everything but save the people.
Tlingit Indians have lived for centuries in the fishing village of Yakutat, an area rich in sustenance. The salmon-spawning Seetuk River system supports commercial and sport fishing and a bountiful wildlife population. But with the now dammed-up lake rising sometimes a foot a day, it could eventually spill into the Seetuk River system and perhaps destroy it.
Beyond the fishing, it's something we identify with. It's our heritage, it's our background, the Seetuk River system.
There may be something that can be done to mitigate the glacier's immediate effects, but it is much too massive a force to bend to the will of man. Traditional Indian culture held that the glacier embodied a spirit, and the spirit alone moves it. Reed Galen, NBC News, Yakutat, Alaska.
Sculptor Henry Moore, whose works are on display throughout the world, died today at his home in England. Moore, who was 88, has been acclaimed by many as the greatest modern sculptor. Henry Champ in London looks at his outstanding career.
Henry Moore was the son of an English coal miner who became the sculptor of his time. His shapes of humans were not always universally understood. Massive torsos and limbs that some admired and many did not. His explanation was that his work interested people, and that it could and should be touched, as he said, after all, it's only stone.
All our judgments of architecture, of form, and everything else are based on the fact that we're human beings of the shape we are. If you don't, well, learn from your own body, you'll learn from nothing.
At New York's Lincoln Center is perhaps his most famous piece, The Reclining Figure. When unveiled, there was an outrage from those who wanted a traditional piece as opposed to the primitive shape he displayed. There is a Moore outside the Houses of Parliament, as there are in many capitals of the world. Few were readily accepted. None today would ever be replaced. His work, he said, was to explore the mysterious line between the human form and the landscape it inhabits.
An artist's value to the rest of the world is that he uses his eyes and to making other people somewhat interested in what he's done. He helps them to use their eyes.
Henry Champ, NBC News, London.
Finally, on this Labor Day weekend, we want to celebrate one of the toughest ways to make a living that there is, being a stunt woman. They not only risk their lives in spectacular scenes, but they have to fight off stunt men trying to take away their jobs. In fact, as Jennifer McLogan reports now, one of the toughest stunts for women in this business is getting hired.
Stunts. Great fun for an audience. Hard and often dangerous work for the people doing them. Almost as hard as doing convincing stunt work is finding stunt work to do. Thousands compete for membership in the union, but fewer than 130 people will perform all of the movie and television stunts this year. Of that number, less than 8 are women. In Hollywood's early days, men donned wigs and dresses and doubled for women in dangerous roles. Since then, little has changed.
And there are a number of smaller men in the business that have been doubling women for years. And they don't want to lose their jobs.
A woman's body, for whatever reason, physically and chemically cannot absorb a car hit.
We're dealing with a group of very nice men who are from the old generation, that women don't do things like that. They'll still want a guy in there with a wig on.
No wigs are needed when Sandy Richmond is on the set. She's making certain that women's roles are women's work. Richmond died at a lobster dinner in the movie FX, drove a pink Cadillac in Wise Guys, was chased by ghosts in Ghostbusters, even took a shot at acting with Woody Allen in Broadway Danny Rose. After 15 years of struggling for acceptance by men, Richmond recently made the jump to stunt coordinator, planning and rigging all stunts on a number of daytime television serials. She's the first woman to hold the role, and she's earned the respect of many stunt men who'd been reluctant to work with women.
Had things gone wrong, I could have come home in a box. Well, of course, Sandy was right on the money as always.
I'm very proud of the fact that I'm considered a one-take person. That saves the show money, saves some production costs, and the fact that I have a 100% safety record.
For the soap opera All My Children, Richmond conceived and rigged this elevator collapse scene, and she put herself right in the thick of it, doubling for Kate Collins in the role of Natalie Hunter.
The director starts to talk to her. He thinks that you're me. Is that right? It gets very confusing. You see what kind of a morning we've all had.
Richmond hired Lisa Kane to double for Susan Lucci as Erica. Not long ago, Kane gave birth to twins, but came back after a 6-week leave. The reason? She wasn't willing to risk losing stunt work to another woman or man. In television, shows with female stars, dramas like Cagney and Lacey and Murder, She Wrote have increased the demand for stunt women. But until more women's roles are written and until stunt women make their mark in movies, Sandy Richmond's work won't end. Jennifer McLogan, NBC News, New York.
We have some new pictures just in on today's plane collision in California in which at least 54 people were killed. Amateur photographer Dean Gross, who lives near the site, heard the crash and left his home to take some pictures. This was the scene just seconds after those two planes crashed in Cerritos, California, some 30 miles south of Los Angeles. An Aeromexico DC-9 from Mexico City headed for Los Angeles International Airport, crashing with a small plane. At least, we are told, at least 51 people on the DC-9, 3 people on the small plane, all 54 dead, and we are hearing reports that some people on the ground may also have been injured. And that's our report this Sunday night. We'll, of course, have more details as they become available. Tom Brokaw will be here tomorrow. I'm Chris Wallace in New York. Good night from all of us at NBC News.